Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the EJAS breakout session with Miss Emily Donovan and Dr. Nicholas Dunning. My name is Reagan Buey. I am a second year student at the University of Cincinnati, majoring in English and political science with a legal certificate study. To begin, we're going to structure this breakout session by asking that everyone indicates in the chat by commenting your name if you would like to ask a question, or if you don't feel comfortable speaking out loud, you can just send your question without your name, and I'll be sure to read it out loud for our guests. I'll introduce you in the order that you are sending messages in the chat so that everybody has the opportunity to speak. So just make sure that you have your microphone on mute. But to get the conversation started, I would like to ask Ms. Donovan and Dr. Dunning, what steps can we take right now in our everyday lives, in our communities, to limit our exposure to these chemicals?
I'm happy to go first. So some things that we can do is you can go to Green Science Policy Institute's website and find out where there's products that are identifying labeling, and stay clear of or use your purchasing power to try and buy. If you're going to buy a sleeping bag, maybe it's time to research how to get a sleeping bag that doesn't have PFAS in it. And when you do that, not only are you protecting yourself, but you're also taking away that supply chain, and you're putting that consumer pressure on the industry that is making these or using these chemicals in a very irresponsible way. I may have an industrial contamination problem, but that problem is because the manufacturers being very irresponsible in how they're making this chemistry. Other things that you can do, we talked about food being a big source, and one thing that we've learned is that unfortunately fast food packaging and eating out and disposable packages are coated with PFAS. And if you think about your pizza box, why doesn't it disintegrate when that gooey goodness is put in that cardboard box? It's because it's coated with PFAS. And if you look at paper mills are some really big emitters of PFAS contamination into their surrounding environment. So we have to remember that this is what I started doing. We do still order pizza, but I then remove the pizza from the packaging when we get home. I don't store disposable containers, keep the food in disposable containers. I remove them and put them on actual plates. And I try to limit the amount of times that we take out food. I think it's okay maybe to eat in a restaurant. That's still fine. Well, non-COVID, but it's okay to eat off of just kind of what you would have done without doing takeout. Another thing too is cooking. If we're looking at convenience products, look at your house. If you're you don't need to rip out a carpet now, but if you're in the market to change your carpet, maybe start doing the research then on the type of flooring that you can get that doesn't have PFAS in it. If you're in the market for getting new cookware, then don't get nonstick. There's no guarantee. I know a lot of manufacturers are putting this is PFAS free on it, or they're putting it's PFOA free, but PFOA free is not PFAS free. But you also don't know what they're substituting it with, and and I'm just not confident about that. Plus, there's plenty of cookware that doesn't use any of this. You can get aluminum, you can get cast iron, you can get stainless steel. There's so many different types of cookware to get. You don't really need nonstick. That's a convenience luxury item. Those are just some of the things. Oh, and for water filtration, you definitely need to beef up your game from the Brita filters. The countertop filters really just aren't going to cut it for this type of contamination if you're concerned about it. And so you start researching, maybe looking at under sink filtration methods for your cooking and your drinking, and decide maybe what a good filter would be for your, just to kind of protect you from any unknown contaminants that you just don't know about.
Emily, there's a question in the chat from Susan, who would like to, as would I, hear your comments on rights of nature.
Yeah, so we were really interested in rights of nature, and so we started digging a little deeper and doing some investigative work. And here's kind of where we landed on it. We decided actually not to pursue rights of nature after doing a deep dive into it, and this is why. The idea of rights of nature is super fun. It's exciting. It's kind of it has that whole I'm hanging out, having a beer with my buddies, and we're just like, let's do this. But what it entails is it entails actually trying to get a referendum of some kind established, maybe with city council. You're trying to get a law on the books that gives the rights of the river over to the community that lives there. Some municipality has to write a law to establish that, which means you're opening up your municipality for lawsuits. But I'm not saying that would be the case. So I'm not saying we're worried about that. But you also don't necessarily need that, because you can already sue on behalf of the environment. The Clean Water Act allows that. So I think it's just kind of understanding maybe what some of the existing laws are in place. And thinking too, establishing rights of nature still means you have to litigate. And so if there's already tools in place to litigate, then use those tools to litigate. Another thing that we found too with rights of nature is in the cases that we saw that were really successful, it wasn't that the rights of nature law created the success. It was that there was enough community pressure that convinced legislatures in the area to actually change the state laws around certain things. And so in the end is what we saw is that it was more of a kind of an advocacy tool to apply pressure to shift the sentiment happening from a regulatory standpoint, which is really where we needed to be anyway. So it's just kind of, I think it's a really cool tactic. And if there's a subgroup that's interested in taking that on, I think that's fantastic. But we didn't want to put our time and energy into it because we felt it might be kind of taking the long way around when we could just work on building enough awareness in our community to pressure better regulatory change right now instead of having to introduce rights of nature as a concept. Maybe not what you wanted to hear. we really liked it, and I was super into it until we started. Then we took a deep dive, and then we are like, okay, maybe not so cool.
Susan, you need to unmute.
I was just kind of asking if I could raise my hand. So what I believe in my long history of environmental research and the work I've done is that there's a fallacy about regulation. Like they it ends in a settlement. It doesn't do the job. It permits pollution. If you cross your T's and dot your I's on that application, you have the permission. Now you legally can't permit. So you can't stop the pollution because they get the legal right to do it. They get the paper with the rubber stamp. And anyway, and again, there's a paradigm shift with rights of nature. We're looking at a new way to look at the earth, not as property, but as an entity that has the right to thrive.
Absolutely, and we completely respect it. And I think where we landed is that we worked closely with the riverkeeper, and the riverkeeper was the one that told us, you don't need to establish a rights of nature to advocate for nature. He spends his whole career doing it, and here's all the tools that you need to use that already exist. And I will say, as far as regulations go, the regulations are as good as the agencies that are willing to enforce them. And that's where the problem is. And so we've decided that, at some point, those agencies are either going to go away or they need to be heavily altered or reformed, or there just has to be, this is a mess. And you're absolutely right. This is a mess. And there is a paradigm shift happening with the whole climate change crisis. There's a big awakening. Many people saying, hey, it is time to protect and be the stewards that we were called to be. And I firmly believe that. I'm seeing even in faith-based communities a renaissance of tackling this. And I'm really grateful to see that. I just think for rights of nature, and I'm not negative or anti, and I definitely will not block anyone, especially in our community who wants to try and champion that. We will be that silent partner that fully supports them. But we just made the conscious decision on our own that our best path forward was to hold our elected leaders accountable, and we do that very regularly, hold our regulators accountable, and provide that education to the community so that they can be better empowered and informed voters, so that we can hold the agencies accountable to do their job. And we've seen some really good success with that. Our state environmental agency was in shambles 4 years ago. We got new governor, new leadership, and now we've applied enough pressure and kept enough accountability that at the agency level, there's a lot of clout that there's a lot of movement that we're able to see. It's not ideal, because rarely anything is, but it's definitely, we're seeing some success, and some quick success, and that's been important to us.
Reagan, I think you were starting to say something.
I was just gonna let Miss Susan know that she could just send in the chat as opposed to raising her hand in case one of us didn't see her. But no, I'm really excited to work with Ms. Donovan through our English Writing for Justice class, as Dr. Highland was speaking of earlier. And it's really interesting to me, all of this that's going on, because I have never studied the environment in any way, shape, or form. And I never even knew about any of this until Dr. Highland was like, okay, we're going to work on this. And I was like, this is happening? Like, this is insane. So diving into this has been a very new experience for me. So I just appreciate all of the information that you've been sharing. And I could ask you questions all day, but I want to make sure that everyone else has a chance to.
Other questions from the group?
I'm seeing things pop up, but for some reason I can't read them. Are you able to see them in the chat?
So I see one. So it's, as a community, who do you appeal to try to get a reform or law and better regulations? Yeah, that's a great question, and it really depends on what we're trying to accomplish. So, I'm trying to think of the most relevant and current example. So here's something that has been frustrating for us. Well, sorry, I'm thinking in my head, and it's really not looking fantastic to you guys. One thing that we've run into as a problem is that our school systems are on these water supplies that are still contaminated. And in fact, but that's because everyone in the community is on the water supply. You can't, when you live in a municipality, you don't get to dictate where your water comes from. I mean, that's kind of the trade-off of being a private well owner versus living in a community, or more urban or suburban community, is that you have municipal water, but you don't actually get to dictate where that water comes from, which means when you find out that it's coming from a highly contaminated source, you're at the mercy of that municipality to advocate on your behalf. Whereas private well owners have a different situation. They do have more control over how they can filter out if they find contaminants in their water. But unfortunately, the trade-off that they have is sometimes it is overwhelming and an incredibly expensive process, especially if the contamination impacts their whole entire property, and their property value decreases because of that, and they don't have that collective bargaining that you get from a municipality. So, the reason why I bring that up is because we saw in North Carolina, what we have seen is that there was a consent order between Comores and the state, and this consent order was agreed to because our river keepers sued both entities under the Clean Water Act. And what was born from that consent agreement was that private well owners would be given immediate relief so if their wells tested positive, then they would get bottled water immediately, and Chemours would pay for it. And in that consent agreement for surface water, which is the river, they would stop it at the source. So Chemours was responsible for paying to stop the contamination at the source. And so that meant that the communities downstream who were drinking from the river were not getting immediate bottled water. Yet we were still being contaminated because there's these background levels that you just could not get out of the river. So once Chemours, the city or the state told Chemours to stop dumping in their process streams into the river, that stopped the majority of the contamination. But there's historic levels because they've been polluting their facility for decades. We had all of this pollution on their property. So when it rained, it would seep into the river from the soil, the contaminated soil. And then the groundwater underneath the facility is so toxic that it leaches into the river. And this is where we're getting our current levels of PFAS. And those levels are higher in our schools than they are at schools that have contaminated wells near the facility. So there's a school, Grays Creek Elementary, and Chemours is giving them bottled water right now, and Chemours is paying to have their a better water system put in place. And their wells actually tested less than my children's school downstream here in my community, and Chemours is not paying for bottled water for my children in my school. And so that's kind of a bit of an inequity that happens. And unfortunately, it's not just my school, it's 49 schools in this area that are still drinking contaminated water. And so what we've done, going back to the question of who do you appeal to try and get reforms for the law, we took that directly to DEQ, but we did it whenever there's an addendum. So we asked them to reopen the consent order. We asked them to amend the consent agreement. We did petitions, with community petitions. We got, I think, like 1,200 signatures. And unfortunately, they did not add our request into the addendum, but we did get a conversation with actually Secretary Regan, who may be the administrator of the EPA, who most likely will be. But we did get a one-on-one. I got to talk to him and explain the situation and brainstorm how we can get our needs met. So that was one way of how we were able to appeal for reform. I've testified before Congress. I meet regularly with my congressional representatives. I meet regularly with my state representatives. I keep them educated on bills and laws that they need to pass. And at the local level, we continue to work with the municipal water systems, with the city council members, to apply pressure to state and federal regulators as well. So that's kind of what we do.
Thank you. I'm curious, the position you mentioned, Riverkeeper, is that something specific to Wilmington, or is it a North Carolina thing, or it's a cool title.
Yeah, no, apparently you can go to school and become a river keeper, and every river in the United States, I believe, actually, it might be an international thing, I'm not sure, but there's a river keeper assigned to most major rivers. And they're a part of the Waterkeepers Alliance. So if you're interested in learning more, I think Waterkeepers Alliance, you can go and Google that. But most river keepers actually have a nonprofit too that they're attached to. Like we have a local nonprofit that supports our river keeper and the advocacy work that he does. And so it's interesting if you live in an area with a river. You want to definitely see if there's a river keeper nearby. They're cool people to hang out with.
Yeah, in Cincinnati, of course, we live on the Ohio, which is a rather complex watershed, but covering 9 states, I think. But we do also have several rivers that drain into the Ohio through the greater municipality, and I'd be interested in finding out if they each have a keeper and what their role it is.
Yeah, you have to go to Waterkeeper Alliance. They'll be able to plug you in. I'm going to read through some of these comments. Someone made a comment. I worked with EPA regulation, and we found that we had to write at a 6th grade level for people to understand the issue. We tried to offer 2 levels, but people chose the simpler version. Yeah, you know what? I have a marketing communication background, and that's just humanity. We were always taught to write at and you know what? And the success that I have found in advocacy is that I do things to sort of know what science communicates. I don't even have a science background. I graduated with a policy science. Poli-sci degree, and I didn't. Actually, I had a hard topics, which doesn't feel like the case today. I felt that it had some tech issues before I logged on. Science communication is incredibly powerful. We're seeing that with this pandemic. There's a lot of misinformation. A lot of that's compounded by social media. Where it's here to stay, so we just all need to learn to live with it. But we also need to learn how to communicate in it. It's a really horrible organizing tool. We're seeing the good and the bad, but I think that's humanity as well. Whenever we're addressed with an issue, there's a pendulum that swings. It swings one way, and it inevitably will swing back the other way. And we just have to be mindful of that. So yeah, I always try. It's really successful when you can take a hard topic and put it on a 3rd grader's reading level. You'll definitely get more buy-in from people because it's not that people are need you to dumb it down. It's I think that we're all focused in other arenas that we don't have time to switch mental gears. Just give me the short, fast, quick version. Make it easy, please. Because we're just being fed too much information. The next comment I have is the federal preemption can override local and state ability to protect resources. You know what? You're right. We have a law here in North Carolina that actually makes it. It's called the Hardison Amendment. A lot of states, I think, passed similar amendments, and basically it bars a state from passing a law that is stricter than what the federal. That is more lenient, I think, than what the federal government. Well, I get it backwards. But anyway. We had some issues up front with the Hardison Amendment in North Carolina where a lot of our state legislators were told we can't do anything about PFAS until the federal government does something about PFAS because the Hardison Amendment won't let us do that. And what we learned is that was incorrect. Because the federal government actually doesn't have anything on the books for PFAS, states can. And even if a state does have one of these overriding laws, a state can act in the absence of federal law. And so right now we've been able to see some moderate success in North Carolina because the federal government has not acted. I don't know if I answered that question correctly. A lot of people are in WebEx purgatory, and I don't know how to help them, so hopefully Regan can do that.
No, we're here now. We missed the first 22 minutes of whatever happened here. So, hi.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I'm so excited to finally be able to hear what's going on.
Yay! So sorry. What's your advice for engaging young people in these issues and for changing minds of those that may be reluctant? So, engaging young people in this issue, that one is hard. I actually was a youth director. I retired recently last year from being a youth leader at a local church. And one thing I found is that they were very passionate about the issue, but it's also kind of important to remember too that young people tend to be just passionate about whatever's hot. And I'm not trying to discredit the passion of youth, but I've seen a lot of activism wax and wane. And so I think it's really important to give space when young people are passionate about something to not overburden them too much with the gravity of the situation. In other words, don't put it all on their shoulders, but give them the success that they need, like the little carrots to keep moving forward to help them stay engaged. So again, don't put the weight of the adult world on their shoulders, but do share them mic with them, talk, come up and proctor, instead of this is my show, here, come and follow me. Make it more of, yeah, you want this space? Okay. I've seen success. I can't say that I've done a fantastic job of it, but we've seen some success in it, but we've also seen some disengagement happen, and it could just be life changes. Now all of a sudden you're in college. You were really into this topic when you were in high school, but now you're in college and you have other more immediate needs, or you're in college, but now you've got to get a job and you got to move out. You're moving away. So there's a big transient nature that happens with some young people as well. What about the people that are reluctant to have their minds changed? Engage them on an emotional level. We have found through market research, I heard that women are motivated by babies and puppies, and men are motivated by finding out that they've been lied to. So when you can appeal to the threat of safety for an infant, a defenseless infant, a lactating mother actually contaminates. If you have high levels of PFAS in your blood and you become pregnant, you're transferring that in the placenta, and when you lactate and breastfeed, you're actually transferring it further into your newborn baby. And the baby has a bigger body burden than you because there's just not enough. What am I trying to say? There's not enough concentration to disperse. So it's highly concentrated in a tiny, tiny baby. And so I think that's difficult, especially when you're doing cell regeneration. So when you can appeal to a mom, and not get so technical like I just did, but when you can tell a mom that, the one thing that every new mother or soon-to-be mother wants is to give their child the best start possible. And when you do all these things, all the things that you're supposed to do, and then you find out that you accidentally contaminated your children because you ate out too much at McDonald's or you are drinking toxic water, that's a devastating feeling. So just helping educate, I think, ahead of time. And then for men, you tell them about how corrupt the system is, and you remind them what DuPont did, that they lied, and they made millions off of it, and they're still making millions today off this lie. Those are the type of things that we've seen really motivate men and women. And I know that sounds really sexist, but it was actually market research. So I'm just sharing what was shared with me. Why isn't the EPA already requiring chemical manufacturers to run their own comprehensive testing prior to use? Great question. Rather than placing the burden on themselves to run all the necessary investigation. We know our EPA is broken, but there's also a system in place, and it's supposed to be TSCA. And we get into regulation, and I'll be honest, I'm not an expert in this field, but I know just enough to kind of maybe get us through this question. So the TSCA was recently reformed, and in this reform, manufacturers are required to upfront show that the chemical that they want to make is not going to be toxic. And then the EPA says, okay, you've proven yourself, you've proven that there's that this is okay chemical. We will allow you to make this chemical. However, we're going to say you cannot discharge it into the water or release it in the air. Or they're going to say, you know what, based on the toxicological information that you gave us, we think that you can discharge this into the river, but only at this level. And they're supposed to set these parameters. The problem is that the EPA is not doing it. And what we found with the last 4 years, the EPA wasn't doing it because the administration in control of the EPA didn't want to do it. So this is where political will becomes a major hurdle. And I'm not, I'm really careful to make sure that that we're aware that this has happened over multiple administrations, not just the last one. It does, but I will be really honest, the last administration just did a lot worse. But even the Obama years, there was, PFAS could have been addressed, and it wasn't nearly addressed to the level that it could have been. Under the Bush years, Mr. Balot had actually established a criminal case, and the case guy, I think the statute of limitations ran out under the Bush administration. So we have seen a systematic failure across both parties and multiple decades. And that's been really frustrating. And I think this is where we go down to people power. And we have to hold our elected leaders accountable on this topic, and it has to be a ballot box issue, a dinner table conversation. It just becomes something that we all care about. All right, sounds like youth need rebranding of the cause, keeping social media posts regular and current. Yeah, and reaching the youth where they are. I will say the one thing I've noticed is that youth are kind of like a slippery, there's always a new platform that comes up that they're all engaged in. And this is probably, I will say that this Gen Z generation, and this is just my personal perspective, have really kind of defied so many things and how they're growing up. And older generations are really baffled in how to reach them because it's all happening under the radar. You know, it was Snapchat, then it's TikTok, and now it's Discord, or what is going to be the next new thing? And how do you keep constantly trying to reach them when so much of their life is happening on this device? You know, it used to be that you could hear what teenagers were saying just by eavesdropping on them. But now you can't even do that, because all the conversations are now happening in these devices where, you know, unless you're hacking into them, you really don't know where their thoughts are at. That's where we're at, you know, and I don't really have a fantastic answer for it.
I'd like to say, make a comment in terms of engaging young people, and part of that is starting as young as possible, with the idea of establishing connectivity with the environment. You know, your average urban kid turns on the tap, the water comes out, has no idea where that water has come from or what's in it, other than that it's quenching their thirst or filling their squirt gun or whatever. And the same is true with air and soil. I do some work with soil contamination, and there's a naivety that's widespread in terms of a lack of recognition of where things come from, how ecosystems function at a basic level, and where the problems can develop, but understanding sort of the basics of it, that we cannot assume that the water we're drinking, the air we're breathing, and the soil we're engaged with in one way or the other are clean.
Yeah, that's so true. So I got a possibly rhetorical question. How do you fight problem fatigue? There are so many important things that need to be changed and that require people, voter power. There's only so much one person can focus on. Yeah, and so you really have to learn how to be an advocate and an ally. You don't have to be both. You can't be both. So pick what I learned and what I kind of told my youth is, what makes your blood boil? I mean, what really fires you up? That's where you need to be the advocate. And then what do you have empathy for? That's where you need to be the ally. You know, you don't have to show up to every protest, but you absolutely can. You absolutely can be an ally for as many as possible. You need to set personal boundaries for yourself so that you can maintain the fight and not feel constant fatigue. Offices, they are happy. If social media so many messages, more messages than we were ever wired to receive at a given time, and we're learning how to process that. And so just remember that sometimes maybe you need to take a cleanse, take a break, rest, recharge, do those things that personally will reconnect you back with your surroundings. Be face-to-face with someone, take a walk, sit in nature to really understand why you want to fight for nature. You need to do all these things to help you recharge. You'll run on empty if you don't. And see if there's another one. I have a question about how to keep all of this positive and optimistic. There are so many issues that we face today, and many of them are really depressing. Yeah. How do we help inform others about these issues without sounding like doomsday? This is a hard one, because you're right. It is hard to feel like an alarmist sometimes. So one thing that I've found is consider the tone of when you share something. If you're constantly sharing something like outrage, 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 then after a while, people are probably going to tune you out. And so one thing that you can do is just share the information as, oh, hey, here's something interesting. Oh, wow, did you know this? You know, be an informant. People draw their own conclusions instead of offering up the information as, this is how you should think. I've learned that through advocacy, people will know how to form their own opinions, and people respect you more when they can form their own opinions. What they really want is to just find a reliable source of information. And so maybe try and be that. Share something that you think is important, that needs to see the light of day, that could change minds, but don't share it in a way that you're saying you have to think this way. Share it in a way that's like, oh, did you know that that PFAS was recently found in the blood of every American? Did you know too that there's that we can reduce our exposures, and we have seen the levels drop, and the best way to see the levels drop is to maybe stop eating out so much. Or here's an interesting article about food packaging and how food packaging is impacting the amount of PFAS that's in your blood. So you just kind of become a helpful service provider, and you may draw more support that way, and it keeps it a little more positive. And then you absolutely, when there's a success, boy, do you share it. And you share it big, and you make people feel like they were a part of it. Like, yes, we are talking about PFAS in the Senate confirmation hearing for the next EPA administrator. Can you believe we did that? We, and remind people, like, you made that happen. You helped make that happen. North Carolina's on the map. These types of moments, because everybody needs to celebrate. And even if it's such a tiny victory and you had no part to play in it, it's still a victory, and you need to give it the space it deserves. So be a cheerleader when you can, and be an informant when you can.
Ms. Donovan, I would like to ask, for some reason I had to turn off my camera because it's making my computer go slow. But going back to the point about, children not knowing where their water is coming from and stuff like that. When I was younger, I'm currently 19 years old, so when I was younger, about 10 years ago, I